Welcome back to the Provisionist Perspective on this very special Thanksgiving Day episode, and also part 3 of our response to John MacArthur's teaching on why God allows suffering and evil in the world. My name is Drew.
My name is Eric.
And we're going to crack into it today. Give us your questions, your comments. Eric, any introducing words?
So now, Drew, right now you're in a country that doesn't actually celebrate Thanksgiving, right?
That's true. That's true.
Okay. Well, you're going to miss out. You're going to miss out tomorrow. Now, here's my hot take on turkey. Give me your thoughts in the chat. Nobody likes turkey. Everyone pretends to just because it's Thanksgiving.
With that, so you give us your turkey thoughts in the comments. We'll see if we can respond to them. If you have questions that are related to what we're talking about, if you'll write question in all caps or like tag the Provisionist Perspective, we'll be able to see that better and interact there. I love doing these live streams because we actually get to interact with you guys.
Love it.
So questions, comments, super chats, bring them on. And so today, Eric, we've been trying to do this part 3, which was interacting with comments of pushback on our take on John MacArthur's reasons for why God allows suffering and evil in the world. Go back and check out those 2 episodes if this is your first time tuning in. You don't have to watch those to understand what we're talking about today. And I'm actually going to provide you some context. But suffice it to say, we disagree with them on a lot. And I was waiting for kind of comments to come in and stuff, and not very many did. So we're going to interact with a couple different comments today. And then in the latter half of today, we're going to talk about, I found a sermon from John MacArthur on Thanksgiving, on giving thanks. And so we're going to look at a clip of that today and talk about it. But first, I'm going to play a clip from last time that I personally got some pushback on, and then we're gonna talk through it. So here's the clip, and then I will read you. I will put on the screen as well what the person said. It's a 3-minute clip. Buckle up.
Daniel 4:35, and he does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What are you doing?" Call into question any act of his.
It's interesting because, you know, I'm a big just personal advocate in my own life, I guess. Maybe this is the millennial coming out in me, you know, just of authenticity with God and stuff. And so oftentimes I'll wrestle with God in prayer over things and question what he does. You know, Abraham negotiates God down with regards to Sodom and Gomorrah and saying, well, the God of earth do what is righteous, you know, and talks to God and kind of has this kind of negotiation, haggling type thing. And so I agree in principle, God does what he pleases. And if he sets out to do something, get out of his way, because he's just going to do it. If God decides to do something unilaterally, he is, as MacArthur quoted earlier, the only potentate. You're not going to stop him, you know? So that's what I would say about that passage. Any thoughts, Eric?
I just want our viewers to hear the difference here. If you know MacArthur, you know that when he says that, when he's quoting that passage, that none can stay God's hand and none can say to him, what is this thing that you're doing? What he means is, well, then you can't question anything that happens. But you notice that's what the passage says. The passage says you can't question the thing that God is doing. No one is there to be like, well, wait a minute. Was that just? Is that right? Is that good? What is this?
But
thing
on
that
his
you're
view,
doing?
God's doing everything.
Everything.
Right. So
but do
you
notice
can't question anything.
Yeah, but that's not what it says, right? Do you see the difference between what MacArthur means by it, which is you can't question anything that happens, and what the passage actually is saying, which is there is no one who can question the things that God does, to which we say amen.
Right.
So I suppose it goes without saying that I really appreciated what Eric said there at the end. I thought that made a lot of sense. And Eric, I assume probably you've not seen this argument. Can you guess what the pushback is on what I said regarding John MacArthur's take on this before I put it up here and we read it? putting you on the spot.
Probably that. So you're saying that God didn't know?
No, not quite. I will say this before I share this. The reason why I wanted to cover this is because I was thinking, man, okay, maybe he makes a good point. Maybe there's some self-reflection here needed or whatever. And so this is what he has to say. I hope this works. I just had to change settings on my computer to show this. Okay, so this guy's name on YouTube is Jesus People SF. I don't know what that means. Let me know, by the way, if you guys can hear us okay and everything's coming through. So he says, John MacArthur quotes the text, parenthetically, who can question any work of his? Then you proceed to boast in your propensity to question God. While it's true that we, meaning virtually everyone who calls on the name of the Lord and has suffered, almost all answer back to God, is this something to be proud of? Take, for example, the end of all things, the culmination of history, the judgment of mankind, and God displays his purpose in the good and the bad that happened to us, and that made us answer back and question God. This is the kind of setting that the text is referring to. When the purposes of God are seen, who will have a pipper squeak against the Almighty? I think rather than boast that you are the contradiction of the text he quotes, I think you should acknowledge that the questioning of God is always a sign of human weakness at best, and the sin of doubt and unbelief at worst. Be ashamed rather than boast, in other words. So this is what he had to say, Jesus People SF, in response to what I said. And as I was reflecting on this, I think there's something to keep in mind with the Daniel 4 passage, is that it seems to me that who can stay his hand or who can question him, what have you done, seems to me in reference to someone that has been judged by God, someone that's seeing him act and is essentially like an unbeliever on the receiving end of this punishment. Whereas in the broadcast, and even there, I think I talked about Abraham negotiating with God and how that was something that he did. And so I think, I don't know, I think that there's a certain respect in which there's a measure of unbelief and just our own weakness and stuff that we struggle in wrestling with God. But then he said here, put it back up here. I think rather than boast you're the contradiction, you should acknowledge questioning God is always a sign of human weakness rather than boast, and so on. And I don't know, I guess I just think that it's a little bit more complex than that. And so, Eric, do you have any thoughts on this before I give some of mine?
I don't understand the mindset that when it says who is able to answer back to God, they actually think that means that no one can actually speak a word against God or something. Like, I don't if you're a human, you can't question him at all. You can't have any doubts. You can't have any weaknesses, and you can't admit those out loud, or you're boasting, or like he's just saying no one has a legit case against God. Nobody can answer back to God. That's talking about having a charge of sin against him, or a charge that God should have done something else than what he did. That's what that means. I don't understand the premise of therefore you can't question anything he's doing, ask him any questions, wonder
Right.
where he is in a situation as a human being. Right. Like I don't get where they get this idea.
And I guess what he was saying is that I was like boasting and like, I just do this, this is something that I value in my relationship with God. And
I mean, I guess if you want to take what you were saying in the worst way possible.
Right.
I guess that's my point, is that when you have that like Reformed training, and when you have that, let's be honest, most of it, and this is us too, right? Like most of it people get from the preachers online, the Reformed guys online who have online ministries, quote ministries, but they have online teaching platforms, and that's where most people get their stuff, and that us too, right? But if you get these goggles through which you're able to just read things a certain way, and then anyone who's outside the camp, you're taught to read them in the worst way.
Right.
And so you read things literally when it suits you. You read things utterly figuratively and spiritualize things when it suits you. You kind of just you've been handed these goggles through which you view everything, and it's, kind of our job here to push back and say, is that really what he said? Is that really what people who disagree with you are saying? Is this really what the Bible says? That's what our jobs are, I guess.
Sure. And we've always been pretty open, or trying to, in a sense, stay in our lane to say, listen, we're biblical theologians. We're not systematic theologians. We're just kind of wanting to look at what the Bible says and what the character, the people, I don't want to say characters because that sounds like it's fictional, whatever, but like the people in the Bible, what do they say? How do they act? How do they respond? And to this end, I wanted to talk about Habakkuk. So I've been auditing a minor prophets course at Trinity Seminary. And one of the things that it was talking about is that Habakkuk, he has a particular idea of God's justice and his righteousness that he's struggling to square with the reality that he sees outside of himself, right? And hopefully, I don't know, maybe I should uncancel the canceling on my ears so that I can hear when children are screaming and mute myself and stuff. I think I'm hearing some activity here.
Yeah, we're hearing a little bit. It's the joyful noises. Noises.
Joyful Thanksgiving noises.
Look at this, what Ronnie's saying. Going to God and saying, Father, I don't understand this. Like, why this is happening to me is not an unreasonable thing, nor is it questioning God's morality on an issue. Like, I don't see how that's such a hard thing, a hard contrast.
Well, here's the
hold in your mind.
Right. And here's the thing. So let's put this up here. So it says, so this is the pronouncement or the vision that Habakkuk saw. And he says, how long, Lord, must I call for help and you do not listen, or cry out to you about violence and you do not save? Why do you force me to look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Strife is ongoing and conflict escalates. So there's a sense here in which, like, I don't know, where was that comment at again? So he said, Roddy says, going to God and saying, I don't understand is not the same thing as him being unreasonable. But like, I feel like there is a certain sense in which Habakkuk, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he's been given this vision. These are the things that he's saying. Like, I don't know, like you have to fit this in your theology somewhere, right? Like you think of the psalmists that are,
that's exactly
how long, O Lord, and all this sort of thing. So I don't know that we can really take Daniel 4 and just sort of carte blanche, like you're never allowed to question God. Each passage.
But you know what? It's funny is it's not even questioning God. It's along with some of the lament psalms. Are we gonna? Should we do the virtue signal? Should we do it? Okay, I got it. I got my virtue signal in my Bible. Yeah, here we go. Oh man.
I nearly for this segment, I nearly just took it and like read Habakkuk like this, but then I thought it would be nice to have the visual up on the screen, Peter. So thanks for just want to let everybody know we got our Bibles right here.
Yeah, you have this lament psalms, and are you trying to say that when King David is saying, how long, O Lord, will you allow injustice to reign? How long until you do your righteousness thing and bring justice on these people? That, are you saying that David doesn't have a legit beef? Like King David doesn't have a case to say, Lord, you have told us you will do these things. You have made us promises, fulfill your promises to us. He's just off there. There's no grounding based on God's word that God said he would do things. And in the New Testament, when you're talking about in a church discipline situation, in a conflict situation, he says, whoever, this is the context of that often misquoted verse, which is when two or more are gathered, I am there. So in a conflict, when you're dealing with like a discipline issue, you're dealing with something in your gathering, in your group, and you're sitting there dealing with it, I am there. And then he says, whatever you bind in heaven will be bound on earth. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Whatever you bound on earth will be bound in heaven. So he's saying there's an authority you have there to call on my justice, to call on heavenly pronouncements. I give this power to you. Obviously, we have to use it wisely, but like you just said, you have to fit that into your theology somewhere, or maybe you just don't. Maybe you don't. I don't know.
Well, and I think that this comes back to something that I said on Twitter the other day. Follow us on our social media platforms, by the way. I think we're Provisionist Perspective on pretty much all platforms: Facebook, Instagram, and what's the third one? I don't remember, but we're Provisionist P on Twitter, also formerly known as Twitter, now X. So follow us on there. I posted this about how there seems to be this presupposition with regards to your question, Eric, that God always gets what he wants, exactly how he wants, when he wants it. So if you're starting with that presupposition, then of course, when Habakkuk is complaining here, or David's complaining, or whatever, they've not been given the proper perspective that everything is exactly as it ought to be. And this is just part of their process of being sanctified and engaging with God. But we ought not necessarily do that and be imitators of that. And I can hear, Eric, we talk about that little voice, that's like the pushback voice in our ears. I can hear the like, well, you're not David. And I've been thinking about that claim recently too, that, doesn't that make any kind of imitation of any biblical person unfalsifiable, in the sense that, like, if I were to give an example, you say, well, you're not David, or you're not an apostle, or whatever, so or you're not Jesus, so who am I allowed to imitate? Like, if these are godly examples of engaging with God, then who am I allowed? Like, do you have a pleb? Do you just have like a pleb saying something in the scriptures somewhere that I can imitate, because I guess I'm just a pleb because I'm not David or an apostle? I don't know how to engage.
But the apostles were nobodies on purpose. They were absolute nobodies. What's up, Zach? Yeah, if the New Testament taught us anything, it was that Jesus' access to Yahweh wasn't just for kings and prophets, and even the prophets were nobody. Like, I don't know. You can say they became great men, but I don't even think they became great men in the sense that Western evangelicalism understands that. Besides Paul, who had a massive teaching ministry in the ancient world. So they were still nobodies.
Right. Totally. Here's some concluding thoughts on the Habakkuk thing. So I actually didn't read the end of this, and I like the way that this is why the law is ineffective and justice never emerges, for the wicked restrict the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. So it seems to me a straightforward reading of this would just be like, things are not as they ought to be. But this is one thing that I wanted to talk about, and Peter actually, so you've touched on this here, Peter. So he says, funny that Israel means struggles with God. And so this is what came to mind for me as well when I was thinking about this. And I just want to read this in case you're not familiar with the story in Genesis 32. I love this story, and this is prayer. Okay, if this isn't a picture of having a conversation with God, of prayer, then I don't know what is. But Genesis 32, 24 to 32. So I say this is prayer because hopefully we're going to have time, and this is going to kind of segue into Thanksgiving prayer and that. But it says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob said, I will not let you go until you bless me. I love this. I just think it's fantastic. What is your name? The man asked. Jacob, he replied. Your name will no longer be Jacob. It will be Israel. And then this little a means that struggles with God. Because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob, put that in your theological pipe and smoke it, right? Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he answered, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. Jacob then called then named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face. He said, yet my life has been spared. The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. And then this is why they don't eat from the hip socket to this day, the Israelites. And so what a perfect picture of prayer. That in the name of Israel, as Peter has said here, Israel means struggles with God. So are we allowed to struggle with God? Or are we not? Are we just supposed to keep quiet? And that's why, like in the thumbnail, I had me talking like this, a little X over, and Eric's being the good zipped mouth Christian, that doesn't talk back to God. So
there's I think I have two things here. One, in that passage, there's like a little interesting tidbit that I've noticed for the first time ever reading that right now, is that Jacob asked him for his name, but the angel of the Lord doesn't give it to him, because to give someone your name is for them to have power over you. So I wrestled with God and I prevailed, but it's not like I have power over God. I can wrestle with him, but I don't know his name. I can't call on his name. I can't call him. I can lament and say, where are you? But I can't call him. He's not at my beck and call. I don't know his name, that kind of thing. And even now in Hebrew studies, when you come across the word that means Yahweh, if you are any kind of, you even just a basic Hebrew student, you do not say it. You don't say it as you're reading Hebrew, you say Adonai. So you're reading Yahweh, but you don't say it because you don't have power over him. And so yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I think that this is. Oh, go ahead.
No, it's kind of a tangent, so maybe we get to it, maybe we don't. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that this is generally regarded as Jacob's conversion experience. So out of this, it's like he's met God for the very first time. And guys, if you get a chance, go read Genesis chapter 33. It's Esau's appearance after many, many years, and the level of forgiveness and love that Esau shows Jacob is just bunker busting for this whole God hated Esau before he was born and reprobated and rejected him. Like, he's demonstrating a God forgiving agape, just forgiving Jacob even when he hasn't even apologized, type thing. And I just think it's a fantastic account. So that's my thoughts on this particular comment for the beginning part. And then I just wanted to engage with a few other comments. There's one that's quite lengthy that I want to touch on, but feel like I don't want to spend heaps of time on because we have a limited amount of time. But so maybe we'll just go into this next one here. So there's a few highlights here, and Peter, you make another debut here, so you get featured twice. These are a few of the comments that stuck out. So Brandon Ellis says, he designed evil without being responsible for it. When they say irrational stuff like this, they lose rational people. Amen. So that was one thing that John MacArthur had said in his previous video, a comment that I got that I wanted to throw up here. And then Peter said, I think this is from the gaslighting episode that we did, Eric, which we received a number of views on and a lot of compliments. People appreciated that.
Yeah.
If you don't get it, you've got it. So I think John MacArthur said that in that episode. If you don't get it, you've got it. Which just makes you feel like.
That's exactly right.
He just
say that in that episode.
And so here's the longer comment from a brother named Tim Foster. So I won't read his entire story here, but he says, this is a true story. And I'll summarize, and then we'll jump into some of his thoughts and pushback. So he tells the story about a guy from Africa that comes to a conference, and a woman brings him, this African brother, up to him and says, you've got to convince him that the earth is round, that it's spherical, and that it's not flat. And so he's having a conversation with this guy, and he's like, no. It's clearly flat because I see the sun do this every day. I see it like this. And then the other guy's got all the scientific data. He doesn't end up being able to convince him. And so he says, he contrasts this with the two wills of God that there's here. And let me put this comment up here so we can read it together. Here he says, to appreciate the difference between your position and John MacArthur's, it's important to understand that MacArthur sees two wildly different perspectives in place simultaneously.
I'm so glad you're
You
addressing
guys,
it. I read this comment. I'm so glad you're doing this. Go ahead.
yeah, but you guys don't. So when he talks, he sounds like he's making nonsensical statements and contradicting himself, when in reality, he sees himself as merely speaking consistently within one perspective or the other. Any critique of him that doesn't take his views into consideration will necessarily fail to properly represent him. Specifically, by the way, this is a real long comment, so I could tell Tim put a lot of time into this, and so this is why I felt like I wanted to address this. Although he doesn't address it in detail, MacArthur affirms that God has two wills, a secret will, where all that God ordains unchangeably comes to pass, no exceptions, nothing more, nothing less, which we would contend with, obviously, but we'll talk about that in a moment, and a revealed will, where God gives public commands that should be, so there's a secret aspect of things and there's a public aspect of things that should be obeyed, but rebellious creatures might disobey and suffer the consequences. 2, if someone affirms that God has two wills, it becomes necessary for him to speak of only one will at a time. Let's take the earth sun story above, which I summarized for you. If my friend John Paul went home with his newfound knowledge and excitedly told his family at 6:30 a.m. the earth will begin to rotate on its axis, he would be incorrectly mixing traits of those two distinct perspectives. He's got to stay in one lane. Either the sun begins to rise at 6:30 a.m. or the earth continually spins. It's all of either and not one half of both. The phrase stay in your lane definitely applies. So when I first read this, I thought he was like telling us, stay in your lane, or you're not allowed to critique MacArthur. So that's also kind of part of why the thumbnail was up there. But so he says, although this view of two wills is standard Calvinism, various forms of it predate Calvin by over 1,000 years. Even Irenaeus, I don't know how to say his name, talked about man's free will under the direction of God's predestining all things. See Against Heresies, book 2:2. I checked that out briefly, by the way. That felt a little over my head. If that's something that you guys are interested in, we're happy to address that. We're not going to touch on that today. So let me know in the comments or message me or whatever if that's something you're interested in. See also his chapter on free will, where he closes by saying all things are predetermined by God. By the way, I think my brief comment on this is that someone like Tim Stratton has said that he believes all human activity is predestined by God, in the sense that God knew it was going to happen and he predestined it. So in that sense, all human activity is predestined by God. I think that's, I personally wouldn't say it that way. If I held to Tim Stratton's view on divine foreknowledge and providence and stuff, I wouldn't say God has predestined all human activity just because he knows what's going to happen and he creates anyways, but some people articulate it that way. And anyways, so more importantly, the two wills view is an excellent way to explain a number of passages like Exodus 4:21-23 and Deuteronomy 2:29-29, just to name just two. So this is the revealed things belong to us, but the secret things belong to God. But then Tim here is claiming to possess the secret things that belong to God and communicate them to us, right? So I don't understand how that passage is ever in support for that. So as far as the view goes, ipso facto, it is internally consistent. I can appreciate that MacArthur would seem to contradict himself, but as long as he's holding to a view of two wills and speaking coherently from one or the other, he's not contradicting himself. I listened to his entire sermon you linked to, and he's consistent with that view. So another reason why I wanted to address this, by the way, is someone, from what I understand, someone sent Tim our episode and wanted him to respond to us. So I guess it bothered someone enough to send it to Tim and say, hey, you've really addressed these things. Can you address this to these guys? And do you have any, I've been reading for a little while, Eric. Do you want to mention anything before I continue with this question here?
Yeah, I got two things. Tim, your argument doesn't work structurally on its own merits, because what the two things you're comparing two different things, and yet you're trying to equate them. So what you're comparing is two true things that are true from different perspectives, and you can only speak from one perspective at a time for reasons. You know, like you just sort of claim that you can only speak from one perspective at a time. I don't see why that's true. But anyway, that's your argument, that there's two true things, but they're from different perspectives. You know,
how could you speak of two different perspectives at the same time, though? How would John MacArthur do that?
But
I don't understand
let
what
me
anybody's
let,
figuring
let
out.
me address. That's my second. That was the second thing I was going to address. And I'll address that in a second. So you're comparing two things that you say are true. There's a secret will and a divine will, and a revealed will, secret will, revealed will, and then you're comparing that with a flat Earth, round Earth perspective, and having, saying someone who believes there's a flat Earth, but now they have the round Earth knowledge, whatever like that. That doesn't work, because in your comparison with a flat Earth, round Earth, one of those is false. One of those is absurd. The reason that it doesn't make any sense for on the flat Earth, the comparison that you're making, is that that is false. It isn't that somebody isn't seeing something true and they can't understand something true, and they're having a hard time seeing two true things at the same time. They're having a hard time seeing a true thing because they believe in a false thing. So it doesn't work for the comparison of how me and Drew are having a tough time seeing two true things at once. Do you see how that doesn't really work structurally? Okay, so that comparison doesn't really work. That argument doesn't really work. The other thing, I'll address what you said about you can't really say two perspective things at once, and it's totally fine for John MacArthur to speak from one perspective while knowing that he believes in another. But not if he ends up talking nonsense. Not if he ends up saying nonsense things. The proof is in the pudding. Can you talk about two perspectives for once? Can you, like, whether that all is true? There's two perspectives. They're both true. You can only if that whole paradigm is true, then you would be able to talk about it without talking nonsense, without contradicting yourself and making no sense. And he can't do that. You can't do that. You have to use a flat Earth. You have to use a flat Earth comparison.
An example that's not true. Like it's not
an example of something that's not
like,
true.
And you can. The difference is in that example is that the man is speaking of it from his own perspective, but he also has the underlying premise: the Earth is flat. Whereas you could say something that's true from your perspective, the Earth will rise at 6:30 a.m. You're speaking the truth from your perspective, but it's not true that it's like actually rising. Like that premise in your mind is not true. Whereas it could be true that the Earth is rising. Like he's speaking
exactly. You're not going to be able to give me an example of two true things that you can only talk about from one perspective, but they're both true. You're not. I would challenge you. Can you do that? So far, you've only given an example of something that's untrue, and that because they believe something that's untrue, they have a hard time seeing the true thing.
Right. Okay. Here's the rest of his comment. So he says, now here comes some hard questions. Do you guys understand his axiomatic presuppositions and how they work? I got to confess, guys, I had to Google axiomatic presuppositions just to be sure. But axiomatic basically means that something is self-evident, and a presupposition is something that you come to the table with already. So it's a self-evident thing that you're just coming to the table with. And how they work specifically is two wills view. If you don't, then your critiques are in dire need of further refinement. Your comment at 413 that I was talking about, it makes absolutely zero sense in his worldview, is factually incorrect and demonstrably so. By the way, that comment was with regards to John MacArthur saying that God has delegated sovereignty to the demons and the enemy and so on, that they enact in a certain sphere. And we were saying that literally does not make sense if God is controlling everything. And so he's saying it's factually incorrect and demonstrably so. If I tell people the sun rises at 6:30, it is factually incorrect to say that makes absolutely zero sense on his round Earth view.
When you say that the sun rises, you're not making a cosmological argument. You're just using a euphemism to describe the experience we all have of a sunrise. We call it a sunrise. No one thinks that what that actually means is you're doing cosmology. But MacArthur is doing theology on purpose. He's not doing
Right.
euphemisms about
He's
human
making
experience.
two specific theological claims. God
Yes.
is controlling everything, and he has delegated sovereignty to the enemy. And our whole point in that broadcast is how in any meaningful sense can you delegate sovereignty to someone when you're controlling that someone's everything, their thoughts, desires, and actions. By the way, draw near. He's got great stuff. Amos, we really appreciate that. I don't plan on being quiet anytime soon. It's
Appreciate
not
it,
in
Amos.
my mind to be quiet. So
Yeah.
here we are, and here we will remain, Lord willing. And so here we go. So when you guys talk that way, it's a pretty strong nail in your coffin that you don't understand his view or how his view works. Ultimately, his view may prove to be false, but rest assured, he is internally consistent. And the two wills view has been affirmed by theologians for millennia. And then this is another hard question, right? Or are you denying that he should hold them? You're certainly welcome to argue against the two wills view, but in this video you didn't. You merely rejected the conclusions that result from that view. And by that score, you failed to substantively engage with the heart of the issue. Perhaps you've addressed the two wills view in other videos. If so, you would improve your presentation by linking to it. I personally would be curious to see other ways of explaining passages that are best explained by two wills view.
No, wait a minute. That's not what MacArthur was doing. You're inserting you're inserting a perspective. You're inserting an idea. You're inserting something into MacArthur's sermon in order to explain his contradictions. I think you're trying to give MacArthur an explainer here. I think you recognize, and you said it a little bit, that you recognize that it seems to be contradictory. And so you're trying to add an explainer. But what you're doing is you're adding something that's just not there. And what I mean by that is when you say that we miss him on delegated sovereignty, John MacArthur doesn't switch to talking about human perspective. You're giving him something that he doesn't do. He says from God's perspective, he's still talking about sovereignty at that level. He says God delegated it to them. Did he delegate it to them or not? Even on the revealed will, secret will and revealed will view, the answer to that is still no. I still do not have delegated authority, even if I can read his revealed will and I don't know his secret will. I still don't have delegated authority. So you're like inserting this thing that he doesn't do, and you're trying to add in an explainer, but it doesn't actually work. That's not what he does. He doesn't say he has all the sovereignty, and from your perspective, it looks like you have some, but you really don't. That's not what he says.
And he had an hour to explain all of this, and it would have been a good thing to insert that in there in order to explain some of it, but he doesn't do that. So this may be additional needed information to introduce, but he doesn't speak of it in that way. And maybe, we got to take the whole counsel of John MacArthur's teachings, and I don't know what you would say in response to that.
Or it's possible that somebody is internally inconsistent.
Well, and here's the thing. So my question to Tim and others, others of John MacArthur's followers who would agree with him on this and all of that, what would MacArthur or someone have to say to signal to you that they are being internally consistent? Because he's not being specific, it's left to us to infer that, right? So then at every juncture of contradiction, it would be very easy for one of John MacArthur's followers, people that agree with him on this, Calvinists, to just say, oh, he's speaking from this. Oh, and now he switched to this perspective. Oh, he's speaking. And then you've created something that's unfalsifiable. Like there's nothing that we could point at that would show you that he's being internally consistent and contradicting himself, unless he specifically said, in God's secret will, he has delegated sovereignty, but also in God's secret will, he is controlling everything. But no one's going to talk like that. I just don't understand. And then to the B here, I would say yes, we would contend with that. So I think the issue here is that John MacArthur's got a premise running in his mind that I think is false, which is that God has ordained everything unchangeably before the creation of the world. And what we would look for biblical evidence for that fact would be a passage that uses some language like predestined or ordained. It uses past tense language. It specifies that this happened before creation, and it has either the word all or everything. So you're not looking for he works all things after the counsel of his will, because we're going to look at a passage similar to that in a moment, because that's not pre-creation language, it's not past tense language, and it's not predestined, right? So that's what we would look for. And I challenge you to find me one passage that teaches that. And so then the need for this secret will falls flat. Like you just don't even need it anymore.
My challenge to Tim would be, what if Tim has a certain premise too, and his premise is that there is a heavenly register of truth and an earthly register of truth, and those two things can both be true at the same time. And like you said, you can speak from one register of truth and you're being fine and consistent. You can speak at another register of truth and you can be fine and consistent. And there's a heavenly register of truth and an earthly one, and both can be true at the same time. Tim, what I would ask you and ask you just to consider is maybe that's false. Maybe there isn't a heavenly register of truth that can say one thing and an earthly register of truth that can say another thing. And that when those two things can contradict, instead of just saying to yourself, well, it seems so, but since it's true up here and true down here, then you just have to change your, instead of that, if it seems contradictory, just maybe that it is. And that truth doesn't work that way. Truth is just truth. There isn't a heavenly truth and an earthly truth. I would just ask you to consider that.
Yeah, good challenge. And here's what Tim concludes with. He says, these comments are 30,000-foot comments taking in the big picture. If you want to delve into particulars, feel free to do so. So here we are, Tim. We're delving into particulars, but please understand that this is a busy week for me and I may not have a lot of free time to devote to expounding on details. So I appreciate the time that he's taken to respond to this. And so I wanted to take the time to respond to him on here. We do appreciate it. Pushback comments helps us sharpen and articulate what we believe and what we don't believe and so on. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that, Tim. On the other hand, we have comments like this. Manasseh Jones, he said, I was referred over here to your channel. Can you guys see that? Okay, yeah. You may even call it meticulous divine determinism. I was referred by someone off the Idol Worshiper channel, which can only be a reference to our dear friend and brother, Warren McGrew, over at Idol Killer. If you haven't checked out his channel, are you kidding me? If you're here, you're over there. I'm sure of it. So channel for you to have a debate with me on your lover of self-deterministic, imaginary, autonomous free will doctrine you're currently idolizing, like Warren. Maybe your free will allow you to be examined by an expert in soteriological matters. Just let me know right here. And I didn't get it up here, but he had like a little finger pointing down. And then I said, huh? You want to debate on what? He said, do publicly profess you're a son of God, born again from above by the grace of God, or are you a self-determinist like Leighton Flowers, who worships their idol of having an imaginary autonomous free will? If you're a Leightonite free will worshiper and you have confidence in your testimony matching with your doctrine you teach, I want to have a conversation with you to see if you're a born again son of God, or you're just another actor who's taken on the new hobby of Christianity. I'm ready when you are. Give me that. Okay, I'm confident right here. And then he had another little thing right there. And so I just, I didn't really engage with this any further. And
why?
I don't know if you're going to see this, but what could I possibly show him? What could I possibly show you to convince you that I am your brother? Like the fruit of my life and righteous living? Like I'm not sure exactly what he's requesting here, but nonetheless, I thought it was a fun little interaction. So. And here's a positive comment that I wanted to talk about, and this will segue us into talking about prayer. This is Sharon Louise. She says, good segment. What the Reformed do is they overspecify what the verses are conveying. I thought this was fantastic. I heard John on one of Leighton's videos read a scripture where Jesus was speaking to the Jews, and then without hesitation, he jumped to, this is true of all mankind. when all that could be said was that was true of those people at that time Jesus was talking to. The lesson for all of us is to regard the holy text of Scripture more carefully and guard ourselves from saying things that God has never said, like God has predestined everything before the foundation of the world, for example. Concerning wrestling with God in prayer, as Abraham did with God concerning the destruction of Sodom, amen, brother, prayer can actually change things. It's interesting in Ezekiel where God is pronouncing judgment upon the nation because of their horrible, horrible sin that God says this. This is kind of what got my attention of this comment, by the way, because I just finished, I had a chance to preach, speak, whatever on prayer a few weeks back, and I had to translate everything into Spanish, and this was one of the passages that I had to translate. Well, not translate, you just look this up and then like copy and paste in Spanish because it's in the Scriptures. Anyways, so it says, and I searched for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found no one. Thus I have poured out my indignation on them. I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath. Their way I have brought upon their heads, declares the Lord God. So she says, continuing, God looked to find someone, just one man who would stand in the gap before him for the land, but God couldn't even find one man. Had God even found one man, then it appears from what God said that the outcome might have been different in some way. And that's a really sobering, I think, passage on prayer and on intercession. And this is kind of what I concluded in my message as a challenge to the men I was speaking to, is like, are you going to be that man? Are you going to stand in the gap, or are you just going to do nothing? And I think that's a challenge for all of us. But on that note, we've got 10 minutes left, and I want to play a little bit of MacArthur on prayer, on Thanksgiving prayer, for this Thanksgiving Day. It's Thanksgiving Day here, so what better time to talk about Thanksgiving prayer? And I have a lot more thoughts on Thanksgiving prayer. Time doesn't allow it. Maybe we can do it later. I was thinking about our next response as I'm queuing this up. It could be cool to respond to R.C. Sproul's, if God is sovereign, why pray? That could be something that would be good to talk about. So you let us know if you're interested in that. Here we go. So let me know if you can hear this.
I don't have the time to go through all of the texts of the New Testament that enjoin us to be thankful. I'll just share a few with you that I hope will build a little bit of a theology of thankfulness that may help to encourage you. The overarching principle that sets it all in place is Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. That's really the overarching umbrella that covers every issue of life. No matter what happens, it all falls under the umbrella of Romans 8:28, and it will be by God working together for our good. It may in itself not be good, but God will take a bad thing and turn it to a good purpose for our good and our eternal glory. If you live believing that God is at work, sovereignly controlling all of the contingencies of life, blending them all together, each component to lead to a sovereignly designed goal for your good and glory, then you can handle anything in life and be thankful because you know it fits into the ultimate plan.
So that's some of John MacArthur on Thanksgiving. I'm going to put this up here so we can kind of read it a little bit more closely. You got any initial thoughts, Eric? I know this is kind of springing this on you.
No, I'm actually kind of going a very different direction with it right now. In my mind, thinking, man, that is a really, really great, preemptive strike on any criticism of your leadership or any church hurt or spiritual abuse or toxic ministry that your church might produce. If you just tell people that anything that could ever happen to them, God is going to work it out for good, and it's all for your good, no matter what happens to you.
It reminds
me what we do, no matter what we do to you.
It reminds me of that line from The Dark Knight where he's like, if I say that I'm going to blow up a whole bus of people, it's all part of the plan, but then he says, if I say I'm going to kill just one little mare, everybody loses their minds. So it's like a rogue molecule versus like, this is all part of the plan. and it just there's something about that's comforting to us. It's just all part of the plan. And I think that
that was, can I just pause for a second? Everybody, chat. That was really good. Where has that impression been your entire why haven't I known about this?
I'll say I had it in my pocket, just saving it for a rainy day.
That was really good. I'm legit impressed right now.
Hope you all enjoyed my impression.
They're schemers. Do I look like I have plans? I wouldn't know what to do.
I'm just a dog chasing a car. I wouldn't know what to do if I caught one.
So good.
Okay, moving into this. So, I think that one thing is I was noticing as I was reading this. So, all things that work together for good for them that love God. So this isn't saying that literally everything in the world works out according to the plan of God. He's saying whatever happens to you, God can turn it for good. And he even says this, like he says, where is it? It may in itself not be good, but God will take a bad thing and turn it to a good purpose for our good and our eternal glory. So I think that's true. I think that he can use bad things and turn it into something good, but I don't think that that means that everything is part of God's plan. And so a passage that's centered around giving thanks in all circumstances in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he's turning into give thanks for everything. There's a difference between saying give thanks in everything and give thanks for everything. You can find something to be thankful in whatever situation you're in. You can't necessarily thank God for everything that happens to you because God's hand is not behind all of the evil stuff that happens to you. I would think this would be obvious.
Can you imagine? I understand this is emotive, but real life is emotional. We all have emotions, and practical pastoral ministry deals with people's emotions. Okay. But can you imagine telling a woman who lost their baby that you need to thank God for that? And telling a raped woman, you need to thank God for that. Telling a man whose wife has left him and taken the kids, you need to thank God for that. Like, can you imagine saying that to someone?
No. And this reminds me of, I think it was our very first live that we did here, where this guy was talking about how you know why you have cancer. God gave you cancer, essentially. And our whole point was like, you didn't say that to him. Nobody says that to people. Like nobody says that. You're not going to lead them with this like theological truth, just like hit them over the head with it. Like this is just the facts, here they are type of thing. But so Amber says, I've been told that before. So you can see, I don't know where Amber's at on all of this, but I hope that people would be able to see the harm behind, and the issue is that that's not true, right? And there's a difference between God either determines or permits everything that happens, and God has ordained everything that happens.
Yeah, I'll amend my statement a little bit. When I said, can you imagine saying that to someone? I could see how that would suggest, that I was suggesting that never happens. But I mean, can you imagine how bad that is when you say that to people? And I acknowledge that there are, I want to be as magnanimous as I can here and say that when tragedies happen and when truly terrible things happen to people, they just don't know what to say or do. And so they just say things to make themselves feel better because they're uncomfortable in that moment. And right. So they don't really know what to do. But yeah, the harm of that, that's terrible. I'm sorry. I hope you've heard it said to somebody else and it wasn't said to you. Not that that would make it any better, but yeah, it's terrible.
Truly. So lastly, I want to highlight one inconsistency, and then I got to be going because I have Thanksgiving dinner here in just a few short minutes. But
oh, nice. Awesome.
John MacArthur says this. Yeah, grandma's actually in town. My mom's in town for a few days. So he said this: it may in itself not be good, but God will take a bad thing and turn it to a good purpose for our good and our eternal glory. So keep that in mind. Turn it, right? Here's another quote.
God brings about all things according to his will. In other words, it isn't that God manages to turn the evil aspects of our world to good for those who love him, but that he himself brings about those evil aspects for his glory. So he brings about the evil aspect and then he turns it, and we're supposed to praise him for it. That's their view of God and his people's good. Right. This is right. He literally says, Birkenau and Auschwitz. I mean, I can't, I guess that is just one of the critiques that we hear, that we provisionists hear often, is that, we just don't like God's sovereignty. We just don't like God's sovereignty, or, we use emotional arguments to try to persuade people, and we're caught up in our feels because we just don't like what Calvinism teaches. I can't think of anything more meant to tickle your own ears and assuage your own emotions than saying that the horrors of the Holocaust were brought about by God's good plan. That's just for you, man. Piper, that's just self-talk. You're just talking to yourself, trying to get yourself through the horror of this world. But sorry, it's not that easy. You have to go through it. You don't get to call it good.
That passage that's woe to those that call evil good and good evil.
Oh,
what would Piper and the editors of this book and the authors of this book, what would they have to say to qualify as being among those who are being warned against for calling good evil and evil good? Because this just seems like an obvious example of terrible things. The Holocaust, a serial killer, and the abuse of a young child. The worst things you can think of. God ordained that for his good glory and purpose. It's not that it happened and then he turns it for your good, as MacArthur said, but it's that it was ordained for his glory.
And yet right now, on October 7th, just this last month, we've had the worst. That's what I told him. He even wanted to move it even more Blair Witchy. And I was like, "You're telling a scary story."
I'm doing what I can.
I mean,
doing what I can with what I got.
Right now, you could put that light on it. We're telling a scary story where we actually serve a God who ordains for his good glory the Holocaust. Right now, we have a situation in which those same people who would, and Catherine, I don't know what else to call it except blasphemy. I'm with you. That's that right
Blasphemy
there
is speaking evil of God. It's speaking evil. It's slandering someone, whether it's God or someone else. It's speaking evil of them.
Those same people, I think I'm doing a little bit of assuming here, but I think it's an informed assumption. The same people, conservative, Calvinist, Reformed types, who would support Piper and not really criticize him for that, even if they'd go like, well, I wouldn't say it like that. Like they wouldn't actually say he's wrong about that, are the same people who would defend Israel now and say the worst killing since the Holocaust, which just happened on October 7th. You can't call that good. That was terrible. That was awful. That was evil. And, you don't try to justify that. And all the people marching in the streets trying to justify it. They would be criticizing those people. And I'm just, the cognitive dissonance of that. It's hard for me to fathom.
Yeah. Well, give us a like. Let us know what you thought below. If you have some more pushback or some more questions, or we weren't clear, I read all of the comments so I can engage down there, maybe make a clarifying episode or something like that. Join the patron team if you haven't already. We really appreciate your support up there. Patreon.com/provisionist perspective. Thanks to our choice mates. You've tuned this long. You're officially a choice mate. Congratulations.
You are a choice meat. Everybody here, all 37 of you, choice meats. Congratulations. Even if, it'd be so awesome if some of the hate followers were here and now we're calling them choice meats. You're a choice meat.
Perfect. Hey everyone, tomorrow for you is Thanksgiving. Give thanks to God in everything. There's always something that you can be thankful for. I'd love to do a full episode on prayer, Thanksgiving, and the attacks of the enemy. The Lord's been teaching me a lot about that recently. If that's something that you'd be interested in, comment below. Maybe we'll make it happen. Until next time, be thankful in all things, and don't be a potato. Where's the button?